Hello, welcome to Prismatic Jane Eyre. My name is Matthew Reynolds. I teach English and comparative literature at Oxford. Prismatic Jane Eyre is a research project that's funded by the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, as part of their big research programme in creative multilingualism based at the University of Oxford. And Prismatic Jane Eyre is also hosted by another acronym, OCCT, which stands for the Oxford Comparative Criticism and Translation Research Centre, which is based at St Anne's College, again in Oxford. The idea of the project is to explore, think about, try to understand a fact that in a way is obvious and in another way is really surprising and strange. And this is the fact that translation is not just a matter of producing one text which stands as a translation for one other text in another language. In fact, what often happens, perhaps always happens, is that one translation generates another and another and another. So a poem gets translated into one language, somebody else then does another translation, somebody else does another translation. And the same happens with novels. And of course, translation also happens again and again across many languages. Texts don't get just translated into one language, they get translated into another and another and another. So for instance, in the case of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, this book isn't just an English novel, it's been translated over 500 times by over 500 people, over 500 translators, into more than 50 languages. So that novel, Jane Eyre, isn't just one book in one language. It exists in this strange, multilingual form, a cloud of lots of different words, many different forms of expression, a multitude of reimaginings of what is in some ways the same work by different people in different contexts, using different languages, different resources for expression. And the idea of the project is to try to grasp that astonishing phenomenon and to see what happens when we try to explore it and to work out the best ways of understanding. Let me give you one small example. Let's think about the relationship between Rochester and Jane. In English, when they talk to each other, they use the second person pronoun. They call each other you, of course. Let's imagine the novel remade in a language like French or Italian or German, where there are different ways of saying you. You can use an intimate you, tu in French, or a more formal you, vous. So that means in those translations there's a question which there isn't in the English one. What kind of you do Rochester and Jane use to each other? And when do they change? When is that moment? Is there a moment? And when is it when they shift from calling each other politely to calling each other more intimately tu? Or does one of them do that and the other not? Or do they switch and then switch back? Then how should we think about this thing that's different in the French and Italian and German translations? Is it a development in the relationship that is all along already there in English, but just kind of invisible? So this is an aspect of the work that is sort of inherent and yet can only emerge, can only become visible when the novel is remade in another language? Or shall we say it's a matter of growth and transformation as the work moves into a different language and culture and is remade? Now think about a more different kind of language, such as Korean, which is being studied by my collaborator So-won Park, who's co-investigator on the project. And in Korean there are many more ways of saying you, many more pronouns and modes of address that mark much more subtle gradations of formality and relationship. So when the novel is remade with those linguistic materials, the questions get more complex again. And this is one instance of the sort of thing that the Prismatic Jane Eyre project is interested in exploring. Obviously a project like this needs a lot of people to take part in it. And in fact the work that I'm talking about here is really the work of about 30, 25 or 30 people who form the project group, all collaborating together with different expertise, covering languages that include Japanese, Tibetan, Gujarati, Chinese, Estonian, Spanish, German, Italian, and so In fact, we're exploring in detail about 25 languages. That's about half the languages that Jane Eyre has been translated into. We felt we couldn't try to do all of them, it was just too much. The project goes back to a few years now, it goes back to 2015, when I started to be interested by this idea of prismatic translation by thinking about translation as a process that generates multiplicity, rather than as a technique that's designed to achieve equivalent. So with colleagues here in Oxford, we had a conference under the name Prismatic Translation. And then following on from that, we had a workshop in Vienna. That was in the context of the International Comparative Literature Association, co-organised with Someone Park and with other colleagues from that organisation. So that was quite wide-ranging theoretical work, and there's a book that's come out of that now, which is called simply Prismatic Translation. Then wondering how to move on from that, I had this, what I was worried at the time, and it still does worry me sometimes, is a kind of mad idea of looking at and trying to make sense of the many, many translations of a novel. In fact, the many, many translations of Jane Eyre. Wondering how to take this forward, I wrote to a lot of people whose work I admired and asked them if they'd be interested to take part. And to my amazement, most of them, in fact, I think all of them were. So what that means is that we have a really fantastic research group working together on the project. So what we do, we get together and have workshops. So we share ideas, we look at passages together, we think through the theoretical issues. And we also do a lot of collaborative work online. The first sort of substantial piece of work we've had to do is a really fundamental thing that sounds like it might be quite interesting, but it's in fact really difficult. And that's simply trying to track down all the translations of Jane Eyre that there are in the world. There are big library catalogues called things like WorldCat or the Index Translationum, but there are lots and lots of translations that don't figure in those enormous resources. So in fact, this apparently simple work of just finding the translations, locating them, involves a lot of hours of trawling through library catalogues and even bookshops, in fact, in contexts where there aren't reliable library catalogues, and bringing all that information together. So all the researchers have been collaborating in this work. The postdoctoral research assistant, Eleni Philippou, has been really important in coordinating it all. Before her, there was another postdoctoral research assistant, Rachel Dryden, and they've been helped by another assistant, Chelsea Hay. And the result of that is this enormous list of more than 500 translations that we've put together. Now what that enables us to do is grasp and begin to make sense of this enormous global phenomenon. It enables us to track the processes of translation and to make maps of them. And this is where our digital humanities expert, Giovanni Pietro Vitali, comes in. He's a really crucial figure because he has the expertise that allows us to create interactive maps and other visualizations that enable us to see, and by seeing, understand the processes that are at work. So for instance, to see how variable and sort of how Jane Eyre permeates into the world, as it were, at radically different rates, almost immediately being translated in Belgium and France, as perhaps you'd expect, and also in Russia. But strangely, a version of Jane Eyre appears in Cuba in 1850, so that's just three years after the book was published. A different instance would be a context like Greece, which Eleni Philippou has been investigating. There aren't any translations of Jane Eyre into that culture until just after the Second World War. What we're doing now is bringing all this material together, putting it on the website in ways that we hope are going to be interesting for you to explore. The website address is prismaticjaneeyre.org, and we're in the process of writing a book. So do please visit the website, have a read of it, look at the material, see what you think, tell us what you think, tell us if there are any translations of Jane Eyre that we've missed. The idea of this project really is to be very much a collaborative enterprise. So if you see aspects you'd like us to develop further or have information or ideas to share, please get in touch.